Hello, I am Milda Boyce, Director of Fellowships and Coalitions at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. To those who aren't familiar with VOC, it is an educational, research, and human rights nonprofit organization devoted to commemorating the more than 100 million victims of communism around the world and to pursuing the freedom of those still living under totalitarian regimes. The foundation was authorized in 1993 by a unanimous act of Congress signed as public law by President Clinton on December 17, 1993. On June 12, 2007, President George Bush dedicated the Victims of Communism Memorial Statue in Washington, D.C. And now, with the recently opened to the public Victims of Communism Museum, located in the heart of Washington, D.C., just 5 minutes from the White House. So I'd like to welcome our audience tuning in online today for a panel discussion titled Albania, the Other Communist Country. It's been about 32 years since the fall of communism in Albania, and this is the first, or at least one of the few events of its kind that provides a platform for Albanians to share their personal stories in communist country. VOC is proud to partner with Human Events today on this panel discussion with Brent Hamacek as the representative of the organization and with a group of Albanian Americans who lived and survived the brutality of communist regime in their country and have been nationally persecuted for many years. We are also joined by an Albanian scholar and historian joining us today from Albania as well. So before I hand it over to Brent to moderate this discussion, I'd like to extend a special thanks to Cezar Ndreju, Albanian communist regime survivor, born and raised in gulags. Cezar, along with Brent, initiated this event, so it would not have been possible without him. I also want to thank Ms. Merita McCormack, a wonderful friend and ally of VOC, keeping our team on our toes when it comes to importance of Albanian history in the context of communism. So a few housekeeping rules before we move on. Since this is a 90-minute event, we will start with about a 60-minute panel discussion, followed by a 30-minute Q&A from our virtual audience. And if you have a question to those who are tuning in, please introduce yourself and clearly type your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and the moderator will address them in the order they're received during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I would like to formally introduce our moderator, Brent Hamacek. Brent is the co-founder of Common Ground Campus and the Chief Operating Officer for Human Events Media Group. He has also successfully operated his own business consulting practice since early 2000s. He has written numerous books and has delivered public lectures on 30 different topics, including being a featured keynote speaker at national sales conferences. Brent played a key role in the early development of Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA, have served as an advisor and writing its key foundational student booklets. Brent's most widely read work is titled Understanding and Embracing the Role of 21st American Dissident. It can be found at humanevents.com. Brent is also the co-author of the soon-to-be-released book, Zelenko, How to Decapitate the Snake. Brent, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Milda. It's a pleasure to be here. And welcome to folks that are watching all around the world, we hope. And this is a day for members of the Albanian community and people who have suffered and watched the suffering under communism in Albania to have a chance to tell their stories. Milda is right. This was born of a conversation that I had when the Victims of Communism Museum opened back this past summer in DC. And during the open house and gathering, it became clear to me that this was a country that had suffered just like every other country under communism, but somehow or other, nobody was paying attention. It didn't get the press it deserved. There could be a number of reasons for that, and we'll actually try to talk about that on the show today. But it's my thought there's a whole lot of American citizens, at least, who probably couldn't point to Albania on a map. And if they could point to it on a map, they would have no idea that the members of that country suffered under communism. So we're going to try to do our part to rectify that. Finally, from my perspective, as the person at Human Events Media Group overseeing our platforms, when I had a chance in February of this year to sit down with Tom Winter and Alan Riskin, who were with Human Events and eventually owned it from 1959 forward, I asked them, what was your mission statement at Human Events? And they said, oh, that's easy. It was to fight and win the Cold War. We were all about being anti-communists. So Human Events, which has been around since 1944, is steeped in legacy in this fight. And so it's a real privilege for us to be associated and have this partnership with the Victims of Communism Foundation. So let me introduce our panel members today. We have Matilda Mirakai, who is part of a family of survivors of the Albanian gulags. Irvin Dine, a member of the Albania Diaspora community in the US. Professor Enriqueta Pandelimone, who is a historian at the University of Tirana, and Frank Shkreli, who is the former director of the Voice of America European Division. If I got any of those names slightly wrong, folks, you can certainly mispronounce Hamachek at any point in time during our discussion today. So we're going to start by asking each one of our panel members to spend a few minutes telling you a little bit about their background and what landed them on this panel today. And Matilda, we'd like to start with you. So the floor and the camera are yours.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Brent, and everyone for the opportunity to speak about this important topic that is being forgotten slowly. I was born in 1965, New Year's Eve, in Albania, in a camp. My father started his journey when he was 2 years old in November 1945. As soon as the communists took over, his family, his mother, 28 years old, his brother, 6, and my father, 2 years old, were sent to prison with all the other members of the family. My grandfather had been involved politically with the previous governments. He was an anti-communist, so therefore his family was to blame as well for whatever his ideals were, right or wrong. History remained to decide that. But my parents, my father, 2 years old, was already an enemy of the people. So he started his journey at 2. Got married, had me. So my life is full with stories from my father, my grandmother, my own stories, very personalized history of communism. I remember my father getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning. They were confined to a certain space. Of course, they were free to move within that space because they had to work. They had to work for free. Barely making living for his family. He had to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they would call their names. It was friends of his. They would call everybody's name to make sure they were there, not escaping anywhere, and repeat at 7 o'clock at night. So 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock at night, they had to say that they were present where they were supposed to be. Work during the day. And when I was 14 years old, that wasn't enough. He was arrested. 6 months before that, my uncle was arrested. I was in handcuffs. Then my father, 6 months later, in January 1980, I was a child coming back from school, and saw my friends with a very heavy face, as serious as children can be, and they gave me the news. And I found my mother, my grandmother. The house had been turned upside down, looking for things that didn't exist. They didn't have anything. They lived in these barracks where when it rained, we would put pots underneath because it would leak everywhere. So it was very, very, very poor life. They had nothing. Everything that they had in the past had been taken in 1945. So it was very poor living, and they were looking for documents for anything. Of course, they couldn't find anything. my mother was upset and told them that the only fault my father had was being the son of his father, which was true. I had to leave school at 14 years old and start working to support my family with my mother. We were 3 of us. We would prepare to go to see my father in prison for 3 months, go 3 or 4 times a year. The journey was long, was 3 days. We would see him for 5 minutes, and that's it, and come back home. We would save whatever food we had, the extra. We didn't have extra food. We just would make the impossible and save something for him, and send it to him. And as children, I remember me and my sister sometimes, because my mother used to prepare these cookies for him, and because cookies lived a little bit longer, and she would put it aside. And me and my sister coming back from school, having nothing to eat, we would go sometimes and take a cookie and then feel so guilty that we were taking the food of our father. So he stayed in prison for 10 years. My mother had to work very, very difficult jobs. She came from a different family. Her father had been a communist. He as well had fallen from his mighty power. So he ended in prison as well. My mother, being still the daughter of an ex-communist, they thought that they could break her easily. So they took her a few times, pressuring her to spy on her neighbors. And it wasn't any activity that anybody was doing. It was just the way the communism went. Everybody had to know what everybody was speaking and what they were eating and what they were saying, what they were wearing. So they pressured her a few times. They called her on the side and pressured her to work with them, to collaborate with the communists. And she said, no, I'm not going to do that. And she told them, if you ever call me again, I'm going to take my 3 children and get in front of the train, and that's it. Life is over. I'm just not going to do what I'm not supposed to do. And because of that, put her in the most difficult jobs they could find. They started as a young couple in love, and they had this terrible, terrible life, without doing any crime, without having any faults, just for sticking up to their principles. My grandmother too, I remember her talking about her days as a young woman, being from one concentration camp to another, seeing her friends suffering. I remember her always, when we used to be, as children are, not wanting to eat the same food, let's say every day. We had a lot of beans in Albania. We didn't have meat. Not only us, the whole country didn't have. They had a ratio of 1 kilogram per month. So we had 0. We'd eat beans a lot for winter time. And sometimes we'll say, oh, I don't want to eat it. It's beans every day. And my grandmother always had the story. She said, when we're in concentration camp, they would bring us like a lot of liquid with 5-6 beans on it, and there were a lot of worms swimming on it. And we were terrified, but I told everyone, just close your eyes and eat it. And I always remember that, because she used to repeat, close your eyes and eat it. And we ate with worms. Didn't have anything else. They were starving. And then going through what she went through with 2 children in prison. She was the last woman, actually, to be freed from her internment. She went 28 years old, and she left that camp in she went in 45 and left in 1990 when communism fell. By the time she was an old woman, wrinkled, her life gone. Her children been in prison, both of them, without doing anything, without ever participating in any political thing, being innocent. terrible, terrible stories. I have stories from friends. Recently we've been a well-known director in Albania made a documentary about mine and my friends' experiences in the concentration camp. And one thing that came out of the documentary after seeing it a few times is all of my friends talking about their fathers in prison. We were children left without parents. And because of it, recently, 3 days ago, because watching that and these stories being brought up, I mean, they were buried inside in our subconscious because we need to survive, we need to live life again. But they kept popping up. I guess we're also in a safe space that we can talk about it. And 3 days ago, because of this repeat of stories that I'm again bringing up, I saw a dream, and I don't remember my dreams, but I saw a dream that my father had been arrested again. My father is 80 years old now. Thank God, he's healthy and lives in freedom. But I lived those days that he was being arrested again. And I woke up and I knew that I'm in America and I'm free. But inside me, I had all day the desire to cry. It was that feeling that somebody at any time could come and take away the most precious things in your life, your parents, and you are powerless.
Well, that's a very, very powerful story, Matilda. It shows literally how communism can remain a recurring nightmare. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Irvin Dine, let everyone know a little bit about you and what your path was to get here today.
Great. Thank you, Brent. And I would like to thank you, Victims of Communism, and especially Merita and Cesar Andreu for being involved and passionate about this subject. I think this discussion today is going to be probably one of the most honest that we've had about this topic in Albania in about 32 years. But a little bit about me. I grew up, I was born in a concentration camp in Albania. At 1 year old, my father was imprisoned. His main accusation was propaganda, reading foreign books. I believe one of the accusations listed was spreading Freud's theories to the community where we lived. But that was one of the many different accusations that he had. But I grew up in between two different concentration camps. Between my mother, when she couldn't keep me, she was all alone. I would go to my grandparents. I had my uncles, but they were also in a different concentration camp. My grandparents from my mother's side had done their time in prison a little earlier than my father. So at that time, they were helping to raise me. At the age of 11, my father was released from prison. We were able to move over to Italy, and then we came to the United States. Fortunately, we had some family here that was able to help us settle in. At 12, I came to the US, started school, got really interested in the military. I dreamt of going back to Albania, growing up, hearing the stories. I lived through some of them myself through school, which I'll talk about a little bit later today. But growing up, I dreamt of always going back to make a difference. As you grow older, you realize that one man can't change 80 years of backwards politics. It takes a lot more than one person and a lot of time. I ended up going to Valley Forge Military Academy for 2 years of my high school, 2 years of college. I ended up joining the Marine Corps after that, spent eight years in the Marine Corps, 98 to 2006. From there, I went to Columbia University, have a degree in political science, economics. And I've been involved with Vatra. I was most recently the vice president for the last 2 years. I'm still in the board of trustees of Vatra, but I'm involved in the Albanian community. I try as much as I can to keep with not only the Albanian community, with current events in Albania, For us, growing up the way we did, we always want to see our country flourish. So we always try as much as we can to get as much as we can of it. So, but that's a little bit about me.
All right. Thank you so much, Irvin. Professor, please, if you would, share with our audience your background, which I personally find fascinating, your connection to this and what your approach is. So please share.
Thank you, Brent. And dear Milda, thank you for having me here. And I really feel honored to be here and to share my work experience, but also to listen to the live experience of Matilda and Erwin, and also of Mr. Frank, on their life story, on the communism, on their suffering and their histories. What about me? Well, actually, I'm not coming from the victims of communist families. My family was an ordinary family. A former, let's say, my grandparents were merchants. They were from Permeti in southern Albania. Their properties were expropriated by the state after the Second World War, still striving to survive communism. But my grandfather was put in prison in 1951, but just for a few months. And both my families, from the mother and from the father's side, we survived living in communist Albania as all people living, but we didn't suffer the direct violence, the oppression. Also, we lived under the dictatorship, and we know what I know what dictatorship is and what communism was in Albania. But why I'm interested in studying communism, I'm a professor of history, and all the history of communism in Albania, all the years that I lived during communism. I was born in 1976 in Albania, and I took part, or I saw by myself, the change when communism fell, and I saw the new situation and the democracy and the dreams that the society, that myself, my family, my father, my mom had during the early of the 90s, about the new Albania going towards, let's say, Europe was the slogan of that, the logo of that time, make Albania like Europe. These are the moments that I thought, why not to study communism and to understand by myself, by my own at first, and then to study it and to teach about history and memory with a special focus on the communist period in Albania, and also on the perspective of transitional, and from the perspective of the transitional justice and history approaches with the transitional justice in Albania, what we have done as a society, or as a let's say as a state, in dealing with our communist past in Albania. So I teach history and memory. I teach transitional justice in Albania and contemporary history of Albania, dealing mostly with the entire 20th century history of Albania, but with a special focus on the communist period and the interwar period. What I can state from the beginning of this event, I can state that the breakdown of the dictatorial regimes generally implies a process of so-called rewriting history through school curricula, textbooks, monographs, but also with dealing with the communist past. And these are the questions, these are the topics that I am researching, that I'm studying, that I'm writing about, and I'm teaching at the university. So this was a little bit about my background.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Frank Shkreli, it is your turn, and you have yet another interesting perspective and connection to this, as we've got a little bit of everything on this panel. Please share yours with us so the audience gets to know you.
Thank you, Brent. Nice being with you. Thank you, victims of communism. It's a pleasure. My story is probably very different from most of the participants. I did not live under communism in Albania. I obviously have connections to Albania in many ways through family, but by origin, obviously, but also through my career later in life. I was born in former Yugoslavia, what today is the country of Montenegro. Lived there for about 18, 19 years, very uneventful young age and life. Escaped from former Yugoslavia in 1969 after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Went to Italy, stayed in refugee camps for about a year, left there for the United States, arrived here in late 1970, started learning English, going to night school, working at the same time. English was obviously my most critical thing that I wanted to get under my belt, so to speak, and find a job. Started college in New York for a couple of years, and was very, very disappointed and disillusioned, actually, with the political situation at that time because of the Vietnam War. I had professors, communist professors, who were really teaching us about communism, and here I was, just recent arrival, escapee from communism, and I'm faced now with this situation here in this country as well, where I thought we would have left that behind. As a matter of fact, I did leave it behind. The country recovered from the Vietnam War, the demonstrations and what have you. And I ended up in Washington, D.C., working for the Voice of America for over 30, about 30 years, I should say. And that's another connection of mine with Albania and the communist regime there. And not only a communist regime in Albania, but throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. I was involved with all of those countries and have a perspective to some extent, although it's been a long time now. But so I've had different jobs there, started in the Albanian service, where I worked for about 10, 15 years, including chief of the service. From there, I went to other jobs throughout Voice of America, including at the end of my career for about 10 years, I served as the director of the European division of the great Voice of America. I joined Voice of America because I had been listening to it overseas. And then when I came to this country, I referred to my experience at Lehman College, and I said, you know, what better place to work than the Voice of America? And so I did, and I'm glad I did. After that, after my retirement, I continued to be connected to Albania and Albanian community here in the United States. I became the executive director of a nonprofit organization and lobbying group, partly in the Washington, D.C. area, called National Albanian American Council. Worked there for a couple of years. And then now I do mostly writing for Albanian newspapers and magazines, what have you, throughout the world. I don't know if any of my colleagues, I'm probably a little distinct from them in terms of throughout those years, or I should say through the 80s, I found out later in the years when I visited Albania. First time I had visited Albania was 1991, actually, where I went with the State Department delegation, first one in 50 years to open the embassy and establish some kind of a relationship with, at that point, still the communist regime of Ramiz Alia. So that was a great experience as well, to see the country firsthand as it started to come out of that history of communism. Years later, as they
Wonderful, good stuff. So I hope everybody who's watching can get a sense of what a diverse group of people we have here. And what's nice about that is there's 4 of them, and yet we've covered just about every angle. So that's very well done, and speaks well to the Victims of Communism Foundation for having put together such a good group. So let's test their limits a little bit and ask some questions beyond just your general background. And Frank, I'm going to flip right back to you. So you just came off, now you're going to go back on.
Okay.
And what I want to ask you is, the theme of this is Albania, the other communist country. And I mentioned at the beginning that Albania just hasn't gotten the attention that the other countries have. East Germany, much more famous. Poland, much more famous. Soviet Union, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, both more famous. And Albania is not on that list with people. And as a journalist who covered this and who was with the Voice of America, I'm wondering what your thoughts are as to why that is. Why not the recognition of Albania's earned place along its fellow nations of communist suffering countries?
Well, I'm not a historian, but I think there are a lot of reasons. So the history is, I think, a major reason. 500 years under Ottoman Empire, Albania, after World War I, wanted by the neighbors. Europe really didn't pay much attention starting at that time. Gave parts of different to the neighbors, to Greece, to Serbia, to Montenegro, was occupied by Italy and other neighbors. So a suffering small country, diverse in religion, but not diverse in identity, a country where fought all its life and throughout history for survival rather than have a normal national life like the countries you just mentioned. World War II came, communism took it over, one of the worst communist regimes that I've seen and experienced throughout my career and life. Our panel members know better than I. They've suffered through it. Albania closed itself for about 50 years. That's another reason why people couldn't even find Albania on the map, because nobody went in or came out, with here and there small exceptions. With the exception was really after World War II, where a decent number of people escaped. But after that, you had only occasional escapees. Our panel members here know what would happen to someone if they were caught escaping. Their families would be sent to concentration camps and what have you. The only connection of the Western world, or at least the United States, with Albania was through Voice of America. There was no other way of getting to Albanians. Even that, we had no clue whether anybody was listening. There were threats through our VOA history to closing it down because we never found out anything, no feedback, nothing, if anybody was listening at all. And government and State Department wondered, are we spending this money wisely or do we need to spend it at all? We see no difference whatsoever throughout the Cold War. And then, I mean, it was part of the Warsaw Pact as well. And then they got out because of occupation with, of Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia. Enver Hoxha, then communism, Yugoslav communism was not up to his standard. Yugoslavs, as you know, created the Albanian Communist Party, broke with the Yugoslavs, started flirting with the Soviets for a few years. Then Stalin died and the Soviets turned the tables on Stalin. That was not good for Enver Hoxha, so he closes the country even further. Eventually Khrushchev comes and, you know, the two countries split. He turns to Mao, and Enver Hoxha turns to Mao Zedong. So he's ping-ponging back and forth throughout these, and none of these systems seem to be good for him. So he insists on the Stalinism of the 30s and 40s. Excuse me. And then Nixon visits China, breaks with China, because he didn't want to have relationships with the United, he thinking that that would lead, you know, opening to the United States and the West. So he breaks with China. The 80s come, Enver Hoxha dies. Country barely survives, as your panelists will tell you, for 5-6 years. Ramiz Aliyah takes over. This supposedly was called the Albanian Gorbachev. Well, as far as I'm concerned, he was no Gorbachev. Finally, 1990 comes and things started changing. They were opening up. Albania was opening up a little bit. Negotiations were going on in Washington and New York for opening diplomatic relations. Slowly but surely, in March of 1991, the agreement was signed at State Department, where I attended, for opening or reestablishing, I should say, diplomatic relations between the two countries. We went to Albania, myself with 3 State Department colleagues. About a week later, after we signed the agreement at State Department, opening the new embassy, which was 1 room at the Daiti Hotel, a rundown third world hotel that the best in Albania, by the way. So we worked there for about a month. Then we came back to the United States. We were very, very disillusioned, or at least I was, because I thought that we would find Albania a little better than what we found. I started actually crying to some extent and telling my colleagues, you know, what is this? One of them turns to me and said, Frank, don't worry, this country is going to change so quickly that you have no idea. This country has suffered for almost 50 years under the worst regime in the world. People died, people were sent to concentration camps. I said, well, the best, your words to God's ears, you know. Right. In any case, they said all they need is the telephones to be working, roads to be built, electricity to be working. And this country is going to take off like no country in the world. Where we are 30 years later here, the country really has not taken off. It's the last country in Europe, poorest country in Europe, the most corruptive country in Europe. Unfortunately, a particular area where I'm interested in, freedom of speech and the press. As we speak today, you know, the European Union, before they meet in Tirana in a few days, or rather, they issued a statement criticizing the current government about the limits that it's posing on, putting on the freedom of the press in Albania. So things are not well, unfortunately. Albania definitely was different during the Cold War as a communist country. Albania today definitely is completely different from all of the former communist countries of Eastern Europe. Most of them already have been for years NATO members and European Union members.
Right.
Albania is a NATO member, but is not a European Union member.
So
The current, so maybe I'll stop there. And
still work to be done. Thank you. And Professor, I want to turn to you on the same question briefly. Your thoughts, you are a professor of history, and you're also a professor of history who knows the need of keeping history alive a bit. Your thoughts on this notion of why it seems that Albanian suffering doesn't get the press maybe that it deserved?
Well, yeah, it depends on the ways how we have dealt with with the communist past in Albania. What we have done? What do we know about communism? What about the studies on communism in Albania? If there are some studies, actually there are some. And in regard to the memory of communism, for example, there was a boom of memory studies on communism and on the recalling the communism and on listening and on interviewing, especially the survivors of communism. But still, I would say that this memory boom started from 2010, and we are just in the beginning, I would say, in knowing our own communism in Albania, and the studies that are published mostly are in Albania. Not few are published in other language, and that makes difficult also to focus from outside Albania in the international public on Albania. If you are not a Albania focused researcher, you have to know the Albanian language to listen and to study and to read the Albanian publication. So we need a kind of internalizing, I would say, the Albanian studies on our past. I would say that still in Albania, although these 31 or 32 years have passed still from the collapse of the fall of communism in Albania, what is really a sensitive topic in Albania, let's say the hot potato, is the public discourse, are the textbooks, the school textbooks, the curricula also are very problematic in Albania today. There were some revision on school books and the education school books, but still I would say that we are just at the beginning to understand the old view of studying communism in Albania. So this makes us still to be, unknown from abroad in regard to our communism.
Thank you so much. Interesting, very, very good answer. Matilda, I want to turn to you, or Irvin, you have your hand up, I believe.
Yes,
Apologies,
Brent,
I
I just wanted to chime in on that. So I think if we look at all those other countries that you mentioned, whether it's Poland, number one, the political will in Poland was there. We as Albanians, we've been in transition. I mean, I remember in the 90s, late 90s, trying to read as much as I could. Mr. Shkreli knows the Albanian transition. I bought it in English and I bought it in Albanian as well. But we're still in transition in 2022. And that's the problem. So the transition, it went from communist to sons and daughters of communists in their political spaces. So it wasn't the politically persecuted in Albania were let out of prison, yes. They were given the freedom of speech, yes. But most of them were property owners. They weren't given their properties back. They still, to this day, if you go, there's still some that live in camp-like conditions. And that's why Albania hasn't been noticed as much, because they don't want it to. If the government had the will, if the political will was there to really turn into a true democracy, we would be there today. Albania is a very small country. It has a lot of riches. It could do enough to get itself out there, but they don't. The political desire is not there, at least in my opinion.
So that's a great addition. I'm glad I didn't miss you wanting to make the contribution. Almost blew it as moderator here. Matilda, I want to turn to you. You know, one of the things that people have a difficult time appreciating in the West is we take for granted so many of the conveniences of everyday life. And whether it's the ease of finding, you know, one of your 50 choices of flavored tea at the grocery store, or how quickly you might be able to get in to see a doctor, or how simple it might be to go to a library and pick up a book that you wanted, all those different things that we just take for granted. Give people who don't have any real sense of what it's like to live under totalitarianism, share a little bit of daily life and some of the things that would just be fascinating and almost unbelievable to people in the West who have grown up in comfort and luxury.
Matilda, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted, Matilda.
I'm sorry.
There we go. All right. Yes, we want to hear every word. So please leave yourself unmuted.
Thank you. I do have many memories before instead of in the past, but yeah, I have many stories like that. In reality, Albania, it wasn't. We were people that were persecuted from the beginning to the end. And not even Albanians, some of them knew about our existence. Entire Albania, entire country suffered from communism. It wasn't just us. We just had it the worst. In Albania, let me tell the audience few examples, not just about us, were the worst persecution ever of common people in Albania. In Albania, let's say in 60s or 70s, television started entering. People will see images in hiding. They would images from Italy. They would capture, of lifestyle in West. And people started growing hair or having a pair of jeans that was like in the 70s, wider than it should have been. Those students were taken in the streets. Their hair cut off completely. The jeans were ripped off. These were some examples. Or another example that was every day in Albania was people would line at 3 o'clock in the morning for 1 liter of milk. 1 liter of at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the store, of course, went at 6. So you can imagine the waiting for that liter of milk. 100 of butter. Common people, not for us. We didn't have any of them. We'd have a lot less. But for common people in Albania, they would wait for hours to get 100 grams that was allowed a month of butter, or 1 kilogram in 50 days of meat. It was terrible condition. But, suffering, I've been thinking about because of the panel and some other events we've been having about the past, and I'm thinking a lot. It's not only about being poor. There are people all over the world, even in the free world. The most terrible thing was being a slave, not having the freedom of your own self, not having the life in your own hands, not being able to do what you wanted to do, being taken away at any given moment, not have life at any given moment. I had friends whose fathers were killed for doing nothing. They were just puppets. They were just scarecrows to scare the others. Because once in a while, communism was brutal. And the only way to keep it that way for years was to keep it through terror. And I had friends that their parents were and killed. Actually, of a girl that grew up in a next village, was another concentration camp, was engaged to this guy, and at the same time they took her father thing he had done just to scare other people that they used to do it all the time. And they accused him of being agent of the West. The guy had come to a city, so how could he be agent of the West? Anyway, they took him, made her mother testify against the husband. The father got killed. He was executed. The mother went home and hanged herself. And the girl was engaged. The guy that she was engaged with was afraid to be associated now with her. He left her. She was left, mother killed, mother hung herself, the oldest one in a concentration camp, left to carry for her brothers and sisters. And this is one of the stories. There were so many stories like this. So it's not it was terribly, terribly poor in Albania. But it's not just about being poor. It's about freedom as an individual. Freedom at having your own life in your own hands, being a slave, being told at every second on what to do and what not to do. And of course, what not to do, it was a lot longer list than what you could do. What you could do, it's only survive.
Right. Your mention of slavery turns me to a question I want to ask Irvin. So
Brent, I'm sorry. Can I? So I have a couple of stories to add to Matilda's.
Please.
So I took some stories from some of the people that we both know commonly, including myself. But I had three, and I will go through it quickly. But I just wanted to add to those because when you say we take for granted, I've been living in the United States since I was 12, and I love this country. I was willing to give my life for this country. So I do see people taking things for granted here every day, every moment. So if you would allow me, I will do it quickly as I can. So there's one story of a friend of ours. His father was in prison pre-trial, and he used to come to my grandfather's house every day and say, hey, I had a dream. What's your dream? The party doesn't put anybody in jail for no reason. So they're gonna allow dad back. For 11 days until the trial came, he goes to the trial and he sees, he gets into tell him, hey, you can't get in, you're too young. We don't allow children in here. So it's outside for an hour and a half or whatever long it took, and finds out that his father was in prison for 11 years, 7 years old. So when you take for granted father, mother, or in the United States, never take these kind of things for granted because they're there and they're not. Another story of Mr. Cesar Andreu, that all the men were in prison, and sometimes they would come in, the secret police would come in and take families in the middle of the night, put them in the back of military trucks, throw them in the middle of a camp somewhere else for days on end with children, nothing to eat. And I think in the one case he mentioned, they went to get some food, but they were like, no, you guys are enemies of the state. And he saw the dog being fed, and the kid just went and got the food from the dog and started running so they can eat that food. So when you talk about stories for granted, and then Matilda's cousin, I have a very interesting story with him with the butter. So when we saw butter, it was a good day. It was probably somewhere around the holidays. We'd probably see it once every 5 or 6 months at that. So he said with the shopkeeper's son, he was walking back from school, and the bread truck was coming in, and there's some butter on there too. So the shopkeeper's son said, hey, go ahead and take it. You can have one. So he said, I grab it, I start walking. The minute I start walking, he said, hey, the enemy stole it. They stole it. So he said, I started running for dear life and hid in the fields for a couple hours. And then I get home, but the whole commune had shown up there, and they were ready to send me to re-education camp. So I just wanted to add to that because there's so many of these stories.
Right, the stories
that we in the United States do take for granted, all the freedoms that we have, and hopefully we'll continue to maintain them because we should never lose them.
So If I go ahead, Professor, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, thank you, Brand. Well, listening to these stories of Matilda and Erwin, what comes in my mind is that still, also we have documented the, all the atrocities, the oppression of the communist period in Albania. Still, there are a lot of controversies. There are a lot of controversies, and many feelings in Albania are involved in polarizing the communist, let's say the communist past. And hence, to understand these controversies today, one has to also to understand what was communism about in Albania. And I would like here to mention an aspect of the oppression, following up the arguments and the stories of Matilda and Erwin, the stories of the oppression, and also as the focus of this webinar is the Albania, the other country, I would put it, the other unknown communist country in the middle of Europe, as my country was isolated from it, from the world also till the end of the 80s. And the communist Albania was marked by widespread violence of human rights, murder, individual, collective execution, with and without a court protest, deaths in concentration camps, death from starvation, tortures, evictions, slave labor, physical, psychological terror, genocide, I would say, for political background or heritage ownership, violation of freedom of speech or expression, thought, press, the ban of religion in Albania. So, still today, we don't know the exact number, the figures of people executed or people oppressed in Albania. We know just the names of, let's say, around 5,000 people were established, their names and their IDs were established, but at least more than 48,000 people, including here 10,000 women and children, were imprisoned in concentration camps. So although Albania, let's say, managed to leave communism behind, still its legacy is really present. It's really strong, also because of the lack of the will to deal with the communists and to go and to do a whole process of lustration, let's say, or transitional justice tools in Albania. So, immediately after communist seized power, after the Second World War in Albania in 1945, many political opponents, the so-called war criminals or enemy of states, were arrested, brutally investigated, put in the prisons, but also their families, as the Mirakai, for example, the Dina family that we hear the stories of them today, were put in these barbed wire camps, as the infamous, let's say, the Tepelena in southern Albania, Tepelena camp in southern Albania, which was opened in 1949 and it lasted till the mid of the 50s. And its population consisted mostly of elderly people, families of people that were escaped Albania after the communist seized power, and elderly people with children, and many of them starved. Many of them passed away because of the poor conditions of that camps, and these camps were in function till the end of communism. And the problematic here is that not many knows about these camps, although 32 years have passed since the 90s. Right. Most of the young generation is not aware of what happened in Tepelena or in other camps. And right. That's problematic for the future, I would say.
Thank you. Frank, you have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, the professor mentioned political polarization. I just want to add that it's unfortunately, even 32 years after, it's being pushed by the government and the political parties. Few months, well, more than a few, maybe a year and some months, the prime minister stands up in parliament and says, communism was on the right side of history. The Albanian parliament today has, according to the Albanian media and other sources there, has at least 30 members who in one way or another had connections to the former security apparatus of the communist regime. I just wanted to mention that that's why Albania, even 32 years later, is different from other East European countries. I don't know any case in former East European countries where they might have 30 members of a parliament with ties to the former regime in one way or another. And in case of Albania, this is being ignored by both the current government and the majority party, as well as the other parties in the opposition. So I'm not trying to take sides one way or another. Is this political class that I call throughout my all these years that has brought the country to this point today and hasn't done much to change it.
Got it. Well, sometimes you can change the signage on the door, but if you don't change the people inside, nothing much changes about the operation.
Exactly.
Irvin, I want to let's shift gears a little bit, but build off of something that Matilda said. And she talked about this notion of slavery, that it wasn't just that you were living poor, that you were living as slaves. We did an event with the Victims of Communism Foundation in Silicon Valley in March of this year with the Liberty Forum. And we had a panel of dissidents who had fought back against communism from 5 different countries. And at the end of that, in the closing remarks, Tatiana Menaker from the Soviet Union stood up and scolded the audience and everybody watching on film when she said, "You're not the same country that I came to when I left the Soviet Union. You're a nation of cowards." And she said, "You have to remember that masters don't make slaves, slaves make masters." With that as a backdrop, and mostly I like to work the story in because I love Tatiana's quote. By the way, she brought an eruption of applause from the audience when she said it. I'm wondering your activity in the community today here in the States, in your own community, where I live in the Chicago suburbs, large population of Eastern European immigrants, recent ones, and they are astounded at what they're seeing the West seemingly do voluntarily after what they had lived through and escaped. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, the thoughts are of your community about what you see happen, perhaps particularly here in the United States, in terms of what appears to be a voluntary march towards some form of totalitarianism.
So I think that's a two-pronged approach for us as Albanians, because everybody here can attest to that there's a lot of very conservative people that have immigrated here. But unfortunately for us, there's a lot of people that were here, as Mr. Shkreli mentioned earlier, from the communist state that made their families here. So there's a different mix, but I think for the most part, Albanians see it the same way as everybody else. I mean, you come to the United States, you have your opportunities, your freedom of speech that we didn't imagine where we came from. I mean, as you listen to Matilda and a whole thousands and thousands of other people that didn't get opportunities to go to school or do anything with their lives. And to be able to kind of attack those freedoms and rights, it seems like we're going backwards, and we're going exactly on the opposite way that we've been fighting all our lives. I mean, America, and I have friends from other communist countries, whether it was in the Marines and in college. America was, you woke up America and you went to sleep America when you weren't here. That's voice of America. That's all everybody thought about. And even to this day, they think about, hey, I would wake up and listen to the voice of America. That was the voice. So
thank you.
Yeah, we do.
Little plug, a shameless plug for Frank.
Shameless. I admit.
Lithuanians
So
do the
that.
same thing.
We do see it, but I think if you look at it historically, I think this country has been through many difficulties in its short lifespan. It's a young country, and I think it tests the waters. I don't think the waters are going to be tested that far to where they've tested somewhere else. I think the experiment of democracy has been the best working experiment here. So yes, it's disturbing, and I think 90% of Albanians are disturbed by it. but I also think that it's going to go back to normal. It's going to come back in full circle. And I think people are going to realize that a lot of the stuff that we see nowadays are to the point of ridiculous to some extent.
Matilda, I want to know if you have a thought on this. Are you concerned at all by what you see?
Yeah, no, as we were speaking, I was thinking Albania and how come, because of the questions and thoughts, and to me, Albania became communist was one, let's not forget, it's a small country, but it's the only country in Europe that had more Jews after World War II than before. And none of them were killed. It was a beautiful country of beautiful people. So how does a country from that country where people had this called Besa, if somebody comes in your territory and it's you are supposed to defend that person with your, there was an unwritten rule in Albania, unwritten law, which they lived by. So beautiful people, how did they become these people that terrorize each other, right? Because I did it to Albanians. It becomes because of communism, of those ideals, in the name of the great good, they have the carte blanche to do the worst unimaginable things, to bring worst that humankind have in themselves, to let it free. That bestiality that people have in the name of the greater good. It's that promise for equality, that promise for doing for people, that allows them to do whatever they want and put somebody in trial without anything. And it's a formula that unfortunately keeps repeating. It keeps repeating, and people have very short memory. My children are all college. Although I have spoken to them about my terrible life, I see Marxist ideas on them because it's always appealing, way and being equal. And so it has all this appeal, but people to tell these stories of what that brings, of taking away individuality, the freedom of the individual for the greater good. No greater good. It starts with one. If you take away the freedom of one, that you have taken away the freedom of all the world. There is no people. That is an anonymous thing. It's one. It's me. You take away my freedom, you taken away everybody's freedom. People tend to forget that all the time, and it's really scary. And if we don't talk about these miseries and this what communism does, we always gonna go back there because it's a beautiful promise.
Well,
but it's not real.
I have to tell you, I just jotted down what you said, that the greater good starts with one. And just like I quoted Tatiana here in this panel, I suspect a year from now, I'll be doing something where I quote you, Matilda. So thank you so much for that. We want to be able to get to questions from folks that have chimed in, and we've got only a little time. So what I'd like to ask you to do, Professor, I'd like to start with you. Some brief closing thoughts before we go to take some questions. And Professor, as you make yours, would you please also address a bit the importance of keeping these memories of what happened alive, and at the same time showing people how they have to move on, because that fascinates me a bit. But please, your final thoughts.
I'm not muted, huh? No, all right.
No, you're not muted. You're with us.
Okay. Well, hearing all the stories and also the Tatiana's quoting of yours, and about the memory and about the victims of communism and about the controversies in recalling the past, in dealing with in coming to terms, let's say, with the past, I want to refer to an American US historian who is Charles Meyer. He is a Cold War and Second World War professor of history in US. And he's really interesting. I would like to quote him in his paraphrasing his paragraph. He studied the memory of fascism, communism and also Nazism today. And I want to quote his sayings. He talks in his studies about hot and cold memory, referring to Nazis and to communist memories. And according to me, the way how we come to terms with the communist past in Albania, with the memories, with the victims, with the oppression, the violence, is exactly a cold memory of communism, referring to Charles Meyer. Where from the point of Western intellectuals, as we are hearing here, some of whom are really Marxists for decades, communism, or let's say socialism, was considered and is still considered mild, mellow, because it's not enough studied, and because too many of former communist evidence lack the concept of shame, of guilt, and personal regret toward the victims of communism and their acts during communism. Thus, this is connected also to the nostalgia of communism, which is really present in Albania, and amnesia also, which is really present in nowadays Albania, and especially the youth. The youth don't know, or they don't care, let's say so, about the past. So I would say that. What about these controversies? What about this polarization of, let's say, the proliferation of reaction, controversy surrounding the debate on communist past in Albania, or about the sites of terror, the camps, the prisons, the village, internment villages, suffering, discussed and mentioned here. All these kind of reactions activated the contested memories of communism in Albania. And to me, actually, and unfortunately, it seems that the polemics on the contested past, and especially on the relativization, let's say, of evil, will continue in Albania because of this lack of the will to deal with the communist past seriously. And the process of recounting history revisionism, I would say, as well nostalgia, amnesia, denialism also will be part of this public discourse on communism. And I see a long path toward the activation of the transitional justice tools with a final aim of reconciliation, justice for the victims. Is a long path, I would say.
Thank you very, very much. Frank, some brief closing thoughts from you before we get some questions from the viewers?
Absolutely. Just to close, in terms of memory, as you mentioned, Brent, Albania today is the only former communist country that did not denounce communism and its crimes. There is not one day dedicated to the victims of communism, as all of the other East European countries have done individually or as part of European Union. There are no monuments erected in Albania, as far as I know, to the victims of communism, as is the case in many other countries. There are at least 6,000 people whose fate is not known in Albania. For 20 years now. The international, I forget the name of it, but it's of missing persons, has been to Albania for 20 years, signing agreement after agreement with the governments of different parties, by the way, to help find the graves of these people who were killed and dumped throughout Albania. Nobody knows where their graves are. So those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. In Albania, I see a tendency even now, they don't even refer to communism anymore. They call it monism, as if, you know, it was just another system, but not communism. So unfortunately, today, 32 years after, from what I see today, I am not very, very hopeful.
Thank you, Frank. Ervin, your quick, brief closing thoughts?
So first and foremost, I think I am hopeful in the sense of this discussion that happened today, but I I am with Mr. Shkreli that from an Albanian perspective, from an Albanian political perspective, there's no hope there. I've lost hope there a long time ago. But I think this discussion today, I think, is a start for us as Albanians, for whether it be not only for here within the United States, the education that VOC does for younger students to understand what communism is and what it could lead to. But I think even for in our countries, like Albania, like these other former communist countries, for it to never, ever happen again. Now, in Albania, I still believe there's some semblance of, you can say, socialism / communism. You can kind of throw them in there together. Mm-hmm. But another thing I wanted to add to that we didn't cover here as much because time, I think we can go on here for 3 hours. It's such a pleasant discussion that we can go on 3-4 hours, but freedom of religion. Religion in Albania was really, really massacred. And the 38 Albanian martyrs, there's one that was a female, because this touches everything. How communism didn't just attack one type of person. Women, violence against women. Young lady, Maria Tucci is her name, that was wanting to be a nun, was arrested at 22 for not reporting some people and not giving in. And she was tortured for a long period of time, didn't give in to, the guards wanted to rape her, didn't give in to them. They put her in a bag, in a sack, with an angry cat. And she finally died because all the scratches to her. But I mean, just to get an idea today, because to go back to Brent, what we talked about with taking things for granted and seeing differences in the United States, if we're heading that way, hopefully we're still going to be strong enough to fight that we don't head that direction. But that's where it leads to. I mean, we still have all these freedoms, the freedom of religion and freedom of speech. So, but thank you.
Thanks very much, Herman. Matilda, we started with you, and so now we'll come back and we'll finish this part of it with you. What are your closing thoughts for the people that are watching?
For people that are watching, read, listen, learn from past mistakes. Learn from people like us. We did not read the Animal Farm, read The Big Brother. We lived it. I read it and everything was like I lived it. It's the true story of us. Don't get fooled by ideologies. Don't think about everything. And most importantly, like I said, learn from the past. Because history has always the tendency to repeat. Communism didn't start in modern time. Communism started with Lycurgus. Read Plutarch. Lycurgus started it thousands of years ago and it did not work. And we keep repeating the same exact mistakes with the promise of something ideal and beautiful that does not exist because we don't take in consideration human nature. We never do, but learn from the past and avoid the mistakes because, beautiful saying that I repeat these days. The road to hell was made with good intents. Not all the people that brought communism were bad people or had the intentions to do that. It came as a result of something impossible. They had the good intentions, but it's not a good experiment. So please learn from the past. I say that to my children. I say that to all the youth today. Learn, read, listen.
So wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm looking at the comments that have come in. And the good news is that we have a lot of comments that are very, very positive. But in terms of questions, most people are commenting how much they support what they're seeing. So that's very good news. In terms of questions, there's one that was asked that I think we could go around the group with here briefly. A viewer wants to know what you think of the House of Leaves Museum. Professor, why don't we start with you and what your thoughts are?
Thank you, Brent. Well, I don't know about if you know the House of Leaves, and I doubt that you know the House of Leaves in Albania, but most of us, I mean, all the Albanians know the House of Leaves. It's a museum of the, let's say, of the secret police. It's one of the newest museum opened in Albania. Originally, the house was built in 1931 by and it was used as a medical clinic. During the Second World War, it was used. It was used by the Gestapo in Albania after the Nazi occupation of Albania, and immediately after the Second World War, it was regained by the Albanian government, by the communists, and was utilized as a security office for investigation known as the House of Spies among the ordinary Albania. And most of the investigations were toward the foreigner embassies. Clerks in Albania. And in 2015 came the idea to transform this house into a museum, and it was actually introduced to the public, and it was opened as a museum of espionage, let's say, in Albania. But saying this is the story of the House of Leaves. But in regard to the politics of memory in Albania and the efforts to deal with the communist past and the memory of communism during now, the House of Leaves is just a tiny attempt, I would say, to acknowledge the past. But it's really a kind of, for me, it's like a kind of facade in memorialization of the past in Albania. As Mr. Shkreli previously mentioned, the politics of memory in Albania are really scarce, although we have some legislatives, some laws in regard to commemorating the past. Actually, we have a date in commemorating the victims, which is the February 20th, February 20th. But still, this is also controversial. There is a huge debate on this date because it's the fall of the monument, top down of the monument of Enver Hoxha in the main square of Tirana in February 20th February of 1990, and the victims of communism do not want this date. They didn't accept this date, the 20th of February. But still, this kind of politics of memory in Albania also is really is controversial because what the government in Albania has done is not really accepted by the former victims of communism, NGOs, several NGOs in Albania, by the victims per se, because it's understood as a facade. We do a museum here, we establish some private museums there in Tirana, but the politics of memory is not a deep one to grab the problematic of coming to terms with communism. So for me, the two version of Bunkart, which is a private enterprise in Tirana, Bunkart 1 and 2, and House of Leaves, are just the facade of dealing with the past in Albania. We need a real transitional justice process in Albania, illustration, condemnation of communism, recompensation to the victims of communism, acknowledging textbooks, revising history, revising the textbooks, the school curricula, because communism is really one chapter mentioned in the history textbooks in the college or high schools. And it's not, I mean, the problem that I see with communism is facadization of it versus coming into terms with it.
Got it. Ervin, you have a thought here?
Yeah, and Brent, to the professor's point, to the politics of memory, I mean, there's no politics of memory until the thousands that haven't found the remains of of their dead fathers or grandfathers, how do you remember? What do you remember? And I think that's where, to the professor's point of facade, I think that's where we are today in Albanian politics.
Is Frank or Matilda, either of you have a thought?
Yeah, I did visit that so-called museum. I guess it is. I agree with the professor. It's not. It is a museum of barbaric tools used by communist security apparatus. Really, it has nothing to do with victims of communism in a sense. So, you know, I mentioned the graves that family members are digging themselves throughout Albania to find government not helping them and not cooperating with the international organizations who are ready and able to help. So yeah, there we are.
Matilda, did you have a thought on the House of Leaves Museum and all the appropriateness or effectiveness of it, or a thought on other types of memorials or places of remembrance?
I have not seen the House of Leaves, although I know that it's part of my family. It's in there. One of my aunts speaks there. But no, I don't have, since I haven't seen it, I don't have any thoughts. It's just that very little has been done in Albania. And I think that has to do with the consciousness of Albanians, because it was them doing it to themselves, to their own people. So it's pointing their finger to themselves, and it's a difficult thing to do. But like any disease, like an alcoholic that doesn't admit that he has a problem, he'll never get better. And Albania is the same. We did it to each other. It was Albanians against Albanians that did it. And unless they come out and say, yes, we did a big terror thing, a terrible thing to humanity, to our brothers and sisters, unless they come out and say that, there will be never a recovery. The threat will be always there.
Well put. So I have a quick last question. We've only got a couple of minutes left. So quick take around the screen. One of the common statements about people who support the notion of communism, when you point to the excesses and atrocities and the persecutions in places like Albania, and you say, well, look at what happened with communism there. The standard answer is, well, they didn't do it the right way. They approached it from the wrong direction, right? If only they do it the right way. Quick thought: is there a quick? It's got to be a quick take, Matilda. Is there a right way to do communism?
Yeah, very quick, because I just had that experience 2 weeks ago. We showed the documentary I was speaking about. We showed the documentary in Harvard University, and some person, after all the cries and the pain that came out of the documentary, she said, well, it was Enver Hoxha, it wasn't communism. And it was such an offense to me, to our tears, to our pain. We were being so vulnerable, talking about most painful memories. And she said it was not communism, because communism is not that way, it's the Enver Hoxha. It's the system that gave this person the ability to do whatever you wanted. So if the person is a little bit good, he does not do that many crimes. But if he's more evil, he does as many crimes. So the system gave the power to one individual to use his own personality towards the people.
Got it.
It's
Frank,
a terrible thought.
Right. Frank, quick take. Is there a good way to do communism? Have they just been doing it the wrong way?
It has not worked. It will not work.
Okay.
Anywhere.
I was actually going to ask you the question back, because I'm still searching. I've studied the topic. Has it worked, and where?
Oh, good. Well, the good news is I'll ask the questions here, so I don't have to answer that. But thank you. Professor, very last note. Is there, have everybody just been getting it wrong so far in the 20th century? And here in the 21st, can we do a better job with communism?
Well, yeah, big question.
You only got a short, give me a,
hours of lecturing it. Well, but what I can say at the end is that this topic is really sensitive. It's a really sensitive also because of the contested nature of memory of it and of the suffering and of the victims. And at the end, I would say that however, the discourse or the public discourse on coming in terms with the communist past is becoming, let's say, ever more important in the sense of, let's say, decommunization, transitional justice, illustration, condemnation of communism, reconciliation, justice for the victims. And as well, the debates also use, as well as the debates on the memorializing at the end, the abusive past are really important to be, to follow, to be realized in Albania in the moment that we understand and we are serious in taking this path in reconciliation of the Albanian society, then we will say that at the end we come to terms with our oppressive past.
I have to stop you there. I apologize, but to all of you, we're out of time, but this has been an extraordinary experience. It is humbling for me to get a chance to sit here and ask questions of people with your experiences and backgrounds. And so I am grateful to all of you for allowing me to do that. I am grateful to the Victims of Communism Foundation for letting me win the lottery to host this event. And for all of you who watch this out here today, thank you for your time and attention. Please, when the video becomes available, share it with your friends, drive them to the Victims of Communism website and have them watch and listen. This is an opportunity to reverse a trend so that Albania does no longer wear the label of being the other communist country. So on behalf of the Victims of Communism Foundation, Human Events Media Group, I'm Brent Hamachek, and thanks very much for joining us.